I'm now pleased to welcome John Doma, one of our sponsors from Bateman McKay, to introduce our next speaker.
Okay, thank you, Terry. And it's always a pleasure for us to be joining you and everyone today as a sponsor and a member. Bateman McKay, we always are proud to sponsor Small Business Week. As we all know, small business is the core of our business and the economy. Our next speaker is a new member, as I understand, to the Burlington Chamber, and is not new, although, to the topic he'll be speaking on. Andrew Grubb will be joining us from Inside Job, a new boutique consulting firm that's focused on creating stable, productive, and high-performance businesses, and tailored specifically for the small business community. So with a focus on people, culture, and uncovering blind spots, which are often unforeseen for those of us inside company, and we all experience that. And Andrew's coming into us with 15 years of experience in an innovation and technology-led leader across both large companies, startups, and he uses a combination of coaching, education, design thinking, and startup lean thinking initiatives to drive and transform at transformation at scale. So listen, I'd like to welcome Andrew and look forward to another great speaker. And I just want to say, Lena, that really enjoyed your discussion today. Thank you very much for sharing.
Thank you, John. I was thinking about how I was going to introduce kind of my talk, and I realized that all I think about is like I feel sorry for the poor sap that has to follow Lena. And then I realized that was me. So here we are. So my section will be a little bit different in nature. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a couple kind of observations that I've made, which began as predictions. I'll provide some context around it, and then kind of what that means for like how that's kind of materialized within businesses, and kind of what questions I have and sort of what curiosities I have. So I'm a fairly interactive person. I know I'm meant to talk for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to have about 5 minutes of Q&A. I'll leave room in a few minutes for anybody to kind of interrupt me. I know that's probably going to drive the organizers wild, but I'm pretty interactive like that. So if anybody has any kind of curiosities, they want to shut me down mid-sentence, by all means, go for it. So what we wanted to talk about, the general theme is this kind of idea of the Great Resignation. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with it, but there's been, especially in the US, and most of the stats come out of the US, and some of them are applicable to Canada. Many of them are, but some of them are a little bit different. And so in the US, for something like 4 months running now, the number of people quitting their jobs has hit an all-time record. So progressively in May, June, July, and August, we've hit all-time records, and the records that are being hit are something like 3% of the workforce. So 4 million people per month, roughly, are quitting their jobs. That same kind of relative ratio holds in Canada, which is obviously what we care about. And what's interesting is, we have to kind of wonder, A, why is that happening? And B, where are they going? Which gives us more insight into why it's happening. So based on what we know, there's a couple different levers. So people are feeling really burnt out. There's something that I'm going to call the flip, which is, this kind of goes back to some of the research we were doing a few years ago that's kind of showed up. And sheer indifference from, let's call it, employer indifference due to pandemic related stress or trauma. What I find interesting is there isn't really much evidence to show that people have issues with vaccine mandates as we return to work. That hasn't really been a big part of the conversation. So I'll kind of put that off to the side in case anybody has questions. There really isn't much about that. And I also don't know much about it, so don't ask me any questions because I won't have a good answer. So one thing that's interesting is, and what I'll do, I'm going to go a little meta on you. I'm going to start by referencing some kind of stats that come out of things like the World Economic Forum and large consulting firms, and that kind of adds legitimacy. And then I'm going to kind of talk about why I kind of hate that. So Microsoft did this interesting study, and they found that burnout is being hidden with high levels of productivity, and that's kind of it's sort of like a signal to us that we really have to pay attention to kind of how we're perceiving people at our workforce, whether we're an employee or an employer. I imagine a lot of you are small business owners. And what we're kind of seeing, the signals we're seeing from our people are a lot of the times are symptoms, and those symptoms aren't always related to the cause. So the high productivity we're seeing, whether we're a professional services firm measuring like utilization rates, and we're seeing those really healthy and really high, and yet people are dissatisfied, we kind of can't correlate that because in the past, maybe those two were together and now they're a little different. Or kind of how people in a more virtual environment are communicating. So a lot of times we would manage by kind of walking around. We're very kind of personal people as managers, and that doesn't really work as well virtually because we can't have that same relationship. So we substitute the quality of communication with quantity of communication, and that doesn't always work very well based off of kind of responses from people when they exit surveys and whatnot. So there's a couple of levers there. So one thing that's interesting is, now this is going to start macro. So when we think about 4 million people leaving the workforce every month for the past few months, a logical question would be, so where are they going? And what we're finding is we actually don't know. I'd like based on a lot of our macro measurements. So 4 million people leave, but only 3 million people re-enter based off of job openings. Well, there's a gap of 1 million people. So what are they doing? And I don't know if anybody here is familiar with Adam Grant. He's a Wharton School of Business, huge body of work around, motivation, how people work, meaning of work and whatnot. And I only reference him because he's pretty prolific on this subject, and he doesn't know yet. Not that he matters, but it's a good indicator that we don't really know what's going on because we don't really have the measurements for it. And we don't have the measurements because we haven't really been approaching this with the right perspective. So one kind of theme that we've noticed, and this is where I'll kind of get into the flip. So actually, maybe I'll do like a quick thumbs up poll. How many of you work in an environment with a defined benefit pension plan? So thumbs down if you don't, thumbs up if you do. I want to see thumbs, everybody. Right. So we've got a couple thumbs up, but mostly thumbs down is what I'm seeing. So that may not seem entirely related, but what happened about 20 years ago is a lot of companies shifted away from defined benefit plans to defined contribution. I'm not going to go into the nerdy stuff. If you don't get it, we can talk offline. But what that fundamentally does is it moves the risk of someone's retirement or pension from the employer onto the employee. And so we've had these signals for the past couple decades that employers wanted to take a little bit less risk, and we wanted more of the risk to go onto employees. The idea of loyalty has been kind of changing. And so what that's done is that's created a culture within our working environment where, there were these kind of subtle signals sent out, and we've slowly seen this shift. And I'm going to call this I call this the flip. This is the supply and demand economy shift. So we used to think that it was a privilege to work for a certain company. Both, people, employees, and also business owners. This is how we think, and this is how a lot of people still think, unfortunately. And what's happened is it's now a privilege to hire talented people. And so a lot of companies haven't figured that out. And with all the risk we've been putting on employees and all of the autonomy we've been putting on employees, there's still in some organizations and some industries a culture of expecting loyalty and expecting engagement. And that really hasn't played out. So when I was at Mercer, which is a large HR consulting firm, we would work with a lot of large clients, and it was pretty easy to see which ones adopted that new mentality versus stuck with an old mentality. And over the years, we saw in the ones that stuck with the old mentality of people being honored to work for them, we saw higher turnover, we saw less retention, we saw poorer results as far as I won't argue that employee engagement is a great way to kind of measure satisfaction, but I would argue for something like a net promoter score, which if you have a customer facing business, you're familiar with that. If you don't, then it's maybe a new idea for you. But basically, how many employees would refer their friends to work for the company would be a good kind of measurement for that. And if you start thinking about your employees as they are your customers, then we start kind of redefining how we treat our people. And this is really, really important in this moment. So no one, I wouldn't say anybody was kind of like absolutely ready for this massive shift to being virtual workers. But over like the first few months of it, we had to know that, okay, well, this is something that's here to stay, and we need to kind of create the right environment. And a lot of people did a really good job. The problem is what we have now is we have this whole return to office conversation. So as people were kind of forced, no one really volunteered for this, as we were forced to kind of work from home. That was one scenario. But now that we're all coming back, there's this temptation to kind of go back to the way it was and not ask questions and not treat our people as if they're our customers. And asking things like, okay, so after things settle down, let's say 3 months in, what's better and what's worse? So as we come back to the office, we should really take that into account. And that really kind of like pays tribute to, to your employees being pretty damn important. So the one thing that I'm going to make an assumption here, and that's that there are a lot of small business owners in this group. And so if this message doesn't really resonate with you because you're not a solopreneur, entrepreneur, you're not a small business owner, there's still something to be said about it. So many small business owners, they spend years creating a business in their likeness. So this is, I'm not going to say it's related to diversity and inclusion, but we kind of create things around what problems need to be solved. And we have like our personality becomes our culture, and every new hire we make redefines the culture. And we're very, very careful when we're building our business. So we've kind of created this entity that is an extension of our personality to an extent. And the problem is we have a moment right now where that may not be serving you very well. So people, your employees, they're going to create their own working future with or without you. So it kind of, as we move into people coming back to the office, it kind of doesn't matter what you come up with. It matters if your process is fair. And you have to ask people what they want. And then the next thing you have to do is you have to listen. And a lot of the times, what I see is that this comes from change models or whether it's learning and development. We have this obsession with understanding like a framework or a model, whether it's a change model or an educational model or a transformation model, and we think that the model is the answer. And so we'll hear things like autonomy, mastery, and purpose, if that makes any sense to anybody, or like Jim Collins' good to great, and we'll kind of use that, we'll memorize it, and we'll perfect it. And that doesn't really result in a lot of like great transformation and great outcomes, because there's a fundamental difference between knowing a subject really well and then knowing how to practice it. And what we've seen is that it's all fine and good to memorize and perfect a model, but the outcomes are much more tangible and much more effective and impactful when you breed familiarity with a model and then you actively look for opportunities to practice it. And what that means in our context, like if our context is around a lot of people leaving our companies, and we really want to care for people, and we have to shift our mentality to thinking about them as our customers, and that we have the privilege to hiring them, is we need to ask new questions. So one of my favorite questions to ask companies is, do you believe that the people who created your problems are the same people to solve those same problems? And oftentimes the answer is no. And it's hard to say no, because that means that either the people have to change, or as a business owner, I have to change. So that's a very tough question to be honest about, but honesty is pretty damn important. So I'm going to pause for a second. I've seen some nodding heads and I've seen some shaking heads. I'm going to kind of open it up just for a second to see if anybody has any questions or any perspectives they want to share, or else I'm just going to keep rambling on. Okay, I see smirks. But
well,
there we go.
I'll
Okay,
just
great.
I'll break the ice for you. How's that? So
Thank you.
interesting conversation as well. We're also, not only are we living the Great Resignation, it's extremely difficult to hire. as well. And I guess I'm just wondering what your perspective is. I mean, what really resonated with me, burnout is being hidden by high levels of productivity. That was just like bing, a light went on for me right now, on that matter. But so it's almost though we have staff that are changing for the sake of changing. They're happy. They don't know why they're leaving, but I guess a different screen might be a refresher than what they're living right now. And I guess, can you talk to that a little bit?
For sure. I think so another kind of question, I'm going to answer your question with a question that will frame an answer, sort of overcomplicate it. So one of the curiosities I have is if somebody quits because they're dissatisfied, do we expect them to want more meaningful work experience next time? And are we creating that for our people? So if we kind of put on our empathy hat, we have to kind of put that on for this scenario, and we say, okay, someone quit. Why did they quit? They want something more meaningful out of their next job. So something else, there's something about that next job that was more meaningful than what I was creating for them. So that's kind of an acknowledgement we have to make. So how is it that I can now hire that person? Why would they quit and come to me? And I think an honest conversation with people who are quitting is a really, really important moment to have and to create for a lot of organizations. We have canned exit interviews, and that doesn't always get to a desired outcome. We'll get outputs out of exit surveys, we'll get reasons, and we'll get high levels, but we won't necessarily be able to transmit those outputs into outcomes. So I think, so my simple answer would be, a lot of it comes down to like what people find meaningful. I heard a good friend of mine, she's a VP of HR at one of the big banks, she runs hundreds and hundreds of people in an organization. And her biggest quote from the last employee survey was, "It's never been easier to quit my job." And so the question is, why? And so we have to answer that. We can't just sit with that stat and say, okay, well, we need to go hire a bunch of people, or not. So one kind of anecdote, and I referenced the this million person gap, 4 million people leaving, 3 million people coming back, and then I kind of teased at putting risk on the employee. So one kind of question to ask is, so how much flexibility does a traditional job offer? What's the limit to that? If I want to quit my job and then take a part-time job, and then I'm also going to, work for Uber or skip the dishes, maybe I make around the same amount of money, maybe I work the same amount of hours, but I can lever up and down. And if I have that flexibility, then maybe that's something that you can't offer me no matter what you do. And I'm not suggesting that's the right answer, but it's a curiosity we have to have.
I have an assumption that I'd like to pose to you, Andrew, is in the early days of the pandemic, 2020, March, April, May, I was getting anecdotes from my friends, and it was one of two ways. It was like my employer totally gets it, or they totally don't get it. There wasn't like, oh, I wish you did. No, it was weirdly black or white. Mm-hmm. And so when I heard about the Great Resignation, I was thinking okay, well, people wanted some security through the pandemic, and then but with the true colors having been unmasked in a lot of employers, now is the time in a lot of people's mind. I'm wondering if that was my assumption, but I'm curious if that holds up to what you're seeing in the industry.
Yeah, I don't disagree with any of that. I think what's interesting about it's almost coincidental. So there's been a lot of kind of festering that's been going on. Like, my employer doesn't get it at all. Some people, to your point, Colin, they wanted that stability and they stayed. But now, and it sometimes it's like a little bit of hey, I just don't have the tenacity to put up with this anymore. I'm going to go look. But now's the time whenever a lot of businesses are requiring the people to come back. And it isn't that I don't find it's that businesses are saying, okay, come back to the office or go do this. It's the fair process around it. It's like, did you ask me what I wanted? And it's not like a lot of people aren't, from what I've gleaned, again, I'm going to represent people that, I'm going to represent a generic human here. So, I'm only going to be so accurate, but it's not that people don't feel like they're being heard. It's so that this is another example of the company not listening. And if the behavior is consistent, why would we expect them to change? And if the pandemic has been one of the biggest disruptors in my life and in business in general, and that doesn't even get you to change, then I've lost faith. So I found that, and again, very anecdotal. So I'm kind of continuing on your anecdotal kind of question.
Right. Add a comment there.
Please.
You were saying that it's never been easier to leave a job. I guess my version of that would be, that's super for small firms and companies who are comfortable in a disruptive environment where if I don't have a physical office and the best paralegal who wants to do immigration is in BC and we can manage the time zone, hey, I just got access to like a super duper employee that I might not otherwise have had. So I think there's always the flip side to that. And maybe if you're on the big institutional side, you feel it much more. Of course, you have a larger population and probably much more structure, and those are not bad things, but there's a real advantage if you can be small and disruptive.
I couldn't agree more. I love it.
If I can make a comment, I think it's very important. I agree with you. You need to ask the right questions of your employees. But I don't know if you've been seeing amongst different subsets of groups within an organization have competing or differences of interests around work from home. Because what I'm hearing right now in our organization is our managers are really struggling with work from home. They're working harder as a result. And then obviously, you have our line workers that are embracing the work from home, and so they want more of it. So it's going to be very challenging for organizations to try and meet everyone's expectations in an organization. I think there's going to be competing interests. That's what I feel right now.
Oh yeah, you nailed it. So I refer to this as a preference gap, and there's a problem gap as well. So within line workers, managers, executives, they want different things, and they have different problems. So in your example, what I've seen is managers have a hard time kind of measuring performance. And there has to be, this has kind of forced the conversation around trust, which is a big one. And if you didn't have it, you might not in the future. So there's a little bit of that. But if I'm a line worker and I need to work from home, so there's a technology answer to that. I need a laptop. I used to have a desktop, I need a laptop. But that's kind of, and maybe I need like a collaborative software or something like that. But my needs aren't very great. And then the manager would have an equal need for technology, but it's more communications technology, less productivity technology. So we have to think about things. We have to think about what kind of problems exist per level and per department. I think what's interesting is I have there's one client I work with, and they just came up with this rule, and I thought it was funny because it's not a bad rule. It's how people reacted made me laugh. So they made this rule that said, okay, as of whatever date, it was like 2 weeks ago, you have to be in Canada. And I thought it was kind of funny because they had people working from all around the world. And they said, it's a time zone thing. We're getting like, people are now working at 2, 3 in the morning because you're in Hong Kong or in Ireland or something. And it was just really funny that people were like, more restrictions, because they've really embraced this. And the company's done such a good job creating the infrastructure for people to work from wherever. And they have created this culture in some departments of nomads. And now they want to reel that in. They say, oh, no, we don't want that. They let it happen, which is a good thing. But I thought it was funny that they got to the point where they had to restrict it to an entire country. So there's a lot to be said about kind of the different problems that exist at different places in the organization, for sure. So I'll do a quick time check with Ashley. 5 minutes? Okay, great. So I have one more anecdote to share then. So this is a little bit, I'm going to share it quickly, and then I'm going to ask a couple questions. not to be answered, but to be pondered. So sometimes we have to kind of, like, I've referenced kind of data and sources and whatnot. And one thing that really bugs me about a lot of those sources is how inaccessible they are. So I stumbled across a term yesterday called neurodiversity, and it kind of bugged me because I kind of knew what it meant. And it bugged me that we're choosing to use these kind of terms. So neurodiversity just means a different opinion, basically. It's this idea of the diversity of perspectives. But there's this language created around a lot of research that is it creates boundaries, and it forces this friction between the educational institutions or whomever are creating a lot of this research and small business owners that now have to, and I reference small business, not because it's the businesses I care about, it's the people that I care about. 95% of the working population works for companies under 500 employees. And so a lot of this work is only fighting to help 5% of the working population. And I don't like that. That doesn't make me, sleep well at night. So one of my kind of, constant battles is to make things more simple and more accessible for everybody, not just for business owners, but for people. And sometimes that's just being empathetic. So a few years ago, this is a bit of a tangent. We were launching, I'm not sure if anyone here is familiar with robotic process automation or workplace automation. So we launched a massive initiative within a client, and the big question is, once you automate a bunch of time, what do you do with that? So you can fire people, you can recapture your costs, as they say. We can like reskill people and upskill people. We can enter new markets or do more work, or we can do nothing. And so what we did is we started to embrace this hunch that we had, that we felt like the do nothing was going to be the right answer. And our demographic was about 50 people, and they were all in their, let's call it late 30s to late 40s. Many of them had families and children. And so we just had this kind of hunch that just giving them the time back would be really good. And so it ended up working out to about an hour a day per person for for the foreseeable future, the rest of their lives, as we said. And what we found was that people were getting home an hour earlier. They were having dinner with their families. Our retention went up. Our employee referrals went up. So it was, talented people coming in. So our cost of employee acquisition or hiring went down. And then people felt so good about us just not having expectations around this, that they came back with more opportunities for us to help the business even more. So that was a very, intuitive led decision that we made, but we only got there by listening to the people, but not listening to the words that they said, listening to the messages that they were sending. And so my one takeaway here is, while people may respond to the questions we ask, we have to kind of understand what they're actually saying. And so one couple questions I want to leave you guys with. And we can send these out, or if you want to kind of reach out, we have like a small survey we've put together. It's just obviously it's free. It's just to kind of help you kind of guide a conversation. So when we're talking about a remote worker or remote workforce, so if someone becomes a remote worker, should we pay them less or more? And I think that's a conversation that, if we have some courage, we can have that with our employees. And then the other one about the problems, are the people who created your problems the same ones to solve those same problems? And then there's a question, in the intro, we spoke about, blind spots a little bit. And so I would ask you, what are your blind spots? And I'm going to give you like a little spoiler here, that if you have an answer, it's probably the wrong answer. Leave one more minute for any questions or comments.
On the topic of like, should you pay people for remote work more or less, I heard the CEO of like a large New York bank addressing like his stockbrokers that had moved from New York during the pandemic, and his quote was like, "I'm not paying New York prices to traders that have moved to Utah." And I'm like, what a resentful way of looking at it, as opposed to saying, great. I don't need to pay Manhattan real estate prices if a guy can do his trading job just as well from Utah. Like, why would you look at it from not from an opportunity perspective, which I found like pay them for the value that they're creating for the organization rather than to have like a 2-bedroom apartment in Manhattan. So
Yeah. I have personally lived that. I used to work for Morgan Stanley in New York to Toronto. They gave me a pay cut. So I'm with you.
Hey, Andrew, it's John over here. As an old guy, I'm going to be turning 60 this month, believe it or not. A lot of what I see transition happening with, things that you bring up about, working and treating employees as customers, I think they're all wonderful. I think we embrace that kind of thinking here because it's so hard for us to find people, especially the last 6 months. And, we're getting bombarded with offshore, hiring people offshore. Melissa, you mentioned, that you find a great person in Vancouver. Well, we can find great people in Asia right now, and it's amazing what they want, what they said they can work for in that side, which is pretty scary, I think, for us here in Canada, living here under different conditions. And then, this thing about working in Utah, and I'm going to pay you less. I mean, we pay people what we think, would be the same, regardless of where they are. But it's pretty challenging for small business today. It's just, people coming back to the office, and some, very large companies saying, hey, everybody's got to come back in the office. There's no two ways about it. We've got a bit of a hybrid situation. However, we also listen to our team members to say, hey, I really can't come back for their own reasons, and we keep it open in communication that way. I mean, even I don't even call them performance reviews anymore. We get together once a year. We talk about our team members' goals. We talk about, what they can, what we can do for them and what they can do better for the firm. It's just so interesting to see how things, I think in many ways are a positive way, but it's very challenging. As a business owner, and we've got 40 people here, to run an organization. So, I like people coming in. I like having that, chatter over, coffee and, being able to meet up with people one-on-one. A challenge that we have, I know I can speak for myself as a business owner, is, I can try and reach out to people remotely that are working virtually. They're not always available when you want to speak to them. I mean, you can communicate by emails, but if I got 4 or 5 or 10 files on the go at once, and then you don't hear back from people right away, it gets pretty disruptive, running an organization. Managers say the same thing on that side. So again, it's just getting used to the way things are right now. And it's just, just a comment from my perspective, it's challenging for sure. And there could be opportunities, as Melissa pointed out, right? I can work with somebody in Vancouver that I couldn't have before, right? So it'll be interesting to see how things move, because the whole virtual side, I saw, move forward, a whole decade.
I would just suggest that, I think actually hybrid is harder, because if you're fully remote, like we're fully remote, and we're a team of 4, and then we all have the same tools, we all have the same platform, we all meet equally, with the same restrictions and all the rest, as opposed to like when you were trying to manage teams in the house and teams virtually. I mean, how hard is it if this was an in-person event and 3 of us are on Zoom? It'd be almost impossible to get a word in edgewise, if you're in the video. So I think, one way or the other, like it's almost like, remote is the new in office, in the sense that like everyone's on the same page. I think where the gray stuff is and where the tension is when you get hybrid, because then it's who's home, who's not home, who's in the office, who's commuting, what are the technology tools, and I think that's really where the push and pull is going to be for employers to try to manage what maybe seems like a compromise, but at least from my perspective, it seems like a challenge. Like it's a hurdle to balance basically two different. It's why teachers don't want to teach the hybrid. It's 2 different styles. It's 2 different ways of being. So I don't know. I would just offer that up as commentary that I think hybrid is where the challenges are going to lie.
I got to make one quick observation. Is that from both of you, I heard that time and the cadence of work is such a friction. And what I hear is that you would need to rethink how work is structured in order for this to work. And if that's what your people want, then that's probably a really valuable conversation.